The morning they auctioned her mother's brooch, Cecily Vane stood at the back of the room in a gown the color of old paper and told herself she would not weep. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, as though care were armor. Her gloves were white, clean if not new, and her hair was coiled into the plain knot her maid had managed before dawn, and if the knot was a little tighter than fashion required, if it pulled at the corners of her composure, there was no one in Stanton's auction rooms at 9:30 who would notice or care. The room smelled of candle tallow and yesterday's fire and the particular damp of old things brought out of storage. Around her, 30 buyers examined lots with the detached patience of men to whom other families' histories were only inventory. 3 rows of chairs faced a low dais. On the dais, draped in green baize, sat the morning's objects: a pair of silver candlesticks, a clock in an ormolu case, 2 oil paintings still wrapped in their traveling cloths. And the brooch. It lay apart from the candlesticks, in a small velvet tray the auctioneer had set near the edge of the dais, as though it were too minor a thing to require protection. To anyone who did not know what it was, it looked like a middling piece of estate jewelry, a silver oval not quite 2 inches across, set with garnets and a single pearl at its center, the silver worked into a pattern of leaves around the edge. It was not fashionable. The garnets were not large. The kind of buyer who came to Stanton's for important things would pass it over. Cecily knew what was inside it. She had known since she was 12 years old. When her mother had pressed the brooch into her hands on a November afternoon and told her, very quietly, that it was the document that would one day protect her. The clasp on the back, her mother had explained, was false, a hinge inside a hinge. Behind the silver back panel was a folded square of paper so thin it had grown translucent with years. The paper bore a seal. The seal was her grandmother's, and her grandmother had been the legitimate daughter of the 5th Viscount Ashfield before that title passed sideways to a collateral line and left his daughters with nothing but what they could carry and what they could prove. What her mother had been able to prove, she had folded small and set in silver, and worn close to her heart for 30 years. And when Cecily's father died 18 months ago, when the creditors arrived in the February cold, with their lists and their writs, when her cousin Gerard took possession of Vane House and dismissed her with 1 month's allowance and the inventory of what remained, the brooch had been among the items he had catalogued. She had gone to him twice. The first time, he had told her the inventory was complete and could not be altered. The second time, he had told her the season was expensive and that he was sorry for her trouble. It was his by right of possession, he said, and Stanton's would see a fair return. His voice, when he said it, carried the polished regret of a man who has practiced regret until it costs him nothing. To the rooms and everyone in them, she was simply a poor relation hovering at the edge of a sale that had already been decided. That was the word that traveled the row ahead of her that morning, offered in a low voice from a woman in violet silk to her companion, a woman whose diamonds were exactly the right size for the hour, whose spencer was trimmed in the current fashion, who glanced back at Cecily once with the brief assessment women of her kind applied to women of Cecily's kind, and then returned her attention to the dais. "Poor thing," she said, not bothering to lower her voice sufficiently. The companion said nothing. Perhaps she agreed. Perhaps she was simply polite. Cecily held herself very still and did not look at either of them. The doors opened. She felt the shift in the room before she understood its cause, a change in the quality of attention, the way men who had been studying the dais with comfortable indifference straightened and recalibrated, the way women who had been murmuring to one another paused. She followed the direction of it and found a man standing at the entrance, as though he had stepped in from a different order of existence entirely. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a dark tailcoat, with the particular kind of stillness that comes from long practice in rooms where one's presence is always noted. He wore no expression whatsoever. He looked at the dais, He looked at the room. His gaze passed across the back row where she stood and kept moving, and she breathed again. She had no reason to think he would stop there. His name was James Calloway, the Earl of Ashfield, the current holder of that title, the one who had received it through the collateral line that succeeded when the 5th Viscount's male line ended, the one whose grandfather had been the cousin whose claim displaced her grandmother's branch. He was, in every legal sense, the embodied consequence of the thing she was here to retrieve. He could not have known that. She was not certain he knew she existed. A woman in cheap lodgings in Frith Street, managing on the remainder of her allowance and the small earnings of 2 translation commissions she had undertaken through an acquaintance, and she was not the kind of person the Earl of Ashfield would have occasion to note. He took a seat near the front, his hat set on the chair beside him. The auctioneer began. Lot 1. Lot 2. The candlesticks went to a man in gray who had been watching them from the moment the doors opened. The clock went to no one, the bid stopping well below what the auctioneer had hoped. And there was a brief, flat silence that was the particular silence of a room that has decided something is not worth what someone believed it was worth. The paintings went together to a dealer who had been waiting with a board and a pencil, and the calm efficiency of a man who had made his calculation already and simply needed the room to confirm it. Then the auctioneer lifted the velvet tray and described the brooch in 6 brief words. Silver, garnets, estate piece, no provenance, no provenance. Cecily counted her remaining coins in her coat pocket and waited. She had calculated this many times in the preceding weeks. It was possible that no one wanted it. It was possible that it would go cheaply, quietly, to some buyer indifferent to its history, and that she might find some way to recover it afterward, approach the buyer directly, offer what she had, explain as much as she dared. The brooch could not speak for itself. If it sold to a stranger who dismantled it, who set the garnets into a new piece and melted the silver and never looked behind the false clasp, the paper inside might go undiscovered for decades, might be lost to a drawer or a fire, might simply cease to exist. No one alive but she knew what was inside it, and if no one knew, it could not protect her. She had £2 and 4 shillings in her coat pocket. She had borrowed nothing. She would not borrow. The bidding opened at £3. 4 voices called bids in the first 30 seconds, and then 2, and then the Earl of Ashfield said something in a quiet, level voice that cut under the others like a blade, and the room's 2 remaining bidders exchanged a glance and sat back. The Earl of Ashfield bought the brooch for £11 and did not look at the room when the gavel came down. If there was a sound in her chest at that moment, she absorbed it privately. She turned toward the door, because there was nothing else to do. She was not here to cause a scene. She was not here to claim anything publicly. Because she had nothing to claim publicly. Because that was precisely the difficulty that had brought her here in the first place. She was a woman with a document she had not been allowed to retrieve, and £2 she could not spend on evidence she could no longer reach. She would go back to Frith Street. She would think of something else. She was halfway to the door when she heard his step behind her. Miss Vane. She stopped. She did not understand how he knew her name. She turned. He stood 4 feet away, the velvet tray held in one hand at his side, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not yet read. It was neither the polished sympathy she had learned to distrust, nor the indifferent register of a man who has completed his business and is managing an interruption. He appeared to be simply attending. "You know who I am," she said. "I made a point of knowing," he said. "Before I came." She waited. "Your cousin sent round a note 3 weeks ago," he said, "informing me that a piece of Ashfield estate jewelry had come to him through the Vaughan inventory, and that I might find it of interest for sentimental reasons." He was attempting, I believe, to establish that the proceeds would settle a portion of his debt to me. He paused. He owes me a considerable sum. He has been creative in his efforts to reduce it. She understood then, with the specific clarity that comes when two separate facts arrive in the same sentence. Cousin Gerard's debt. Cousin Gerard's solution. She was, as she had always been, a problem that other people handed to one another, until someone set her down. "I see," she said. "I do not think you do, entirely," he said. He held the velvet tray toward her. The brooch lay in it. "Take it." She did not move. Why? It was not a question, quite. It was the flat, careful thing a person says when they have been offered generosity. They cannot yet afford to trust. When the gift and the giver are both unfamiliar, and the cost is not yet visible. He studied her for a moment in the way she would come to recognize as habitual for him, patient, precise, without the performance of patience or precision. "Because it appears to mean a great deal to you," he said, "and because £11 is not a sum that will disturb my account, and because my predecessor left your family without sufficient remedy for what was displaced." He paused. "And because I have been standing at the back of this room for the better part of 20 minutes, watching you hold yourself together with considerable composure, and I find I do not care to walk out of here having made your situation worse." She looked at the brooch, her mother's silver leaves, the single pearl, the false clasp behind the back panel, invisible unless you knew to look. She took it. She curled her fingers around the cool metal and felt the slight ridge of the hidden hinge under her thumb. And she thought, "He does not know. He bought this blind. He cannot know what is inside it, or he would not be handing it to her so easily, so quietly, as though it were simply a small piece of jewelry that belonged to her and had been temporarily mislaid." She did not tell him. She understood this imperfectly, in the moment. She walked out into the autumn street and did not fully examine her own restraint until she reached the corner, where she stood for a moment under the iron lamp bracket and held the brooch against her palm and tried to name what she had felt when he looked at her. She had not told him because she did not yet know whether the knowledge would matter to him or unravel the small mercy he had just offered. There was a category of men, and she had met several in the years since her father died, who offered kindness until they discovered that the recipient had a complicating history, at which point the kindness reconstituted itself as obligation, as debt, as leverage. She did not know which kind he was. She needed to know who he was before she handed him a reason to wish he had not helped her. That evening, she examined the paper under candlelight in her small lodgings on Frith Street and confirmed what she had always believed. Her grandmother's seal, intact. The notarized record of legitimate birth. Her grandmother's full name in the careful script of the 5th Viscount's own solicitor. The Viscount Ashfield's signature, dated the 12th of March, 1792. A second signature from the officiating vicar of the parish church at Langton, where the 5th Viscount had kept his primary estate. It was unambiguous to anyone who could read it. It was also, she acknowledged, a document that altered nothing about the current succession, because the entail had passed through the male inheritance, and her grandmother had been a daughter, and daughters did not inherit titles. It mattered in the way that true things matter when false ones have been asserted in their place for long enough. It meant she was not merely a poor relation with a claim in sentiment. It meant she was the legitimate granddaughter of a viscount, and there was a dignity in that, a real and nameable dignity that her cousin Gerard had catalogued in an inventory and tried to sell for £11, without knowing what he was selling. It mattered because her name was the kind of thing a person needs to know is true. 3 days later, she wrote a letter to the Earl of Ashfield requesting an appointment of not more than 20 minutes citing a matter related to the estate jewelry he had recently acquired. She wrote the letter 4 times before she was satisfied with it. She was not satisfied that any version of it was adequate. But the 4th version was at least honest. And honesty she could defend. He received her in his study on a gray Thursday morning, 11 days after the auction. The room was large and quiet, with floor-to-ceiling shelves running the full length of the far wall, and a fire burning in the grate, and 2 chairs angled toward the warmth, which she thought was either a deliberate courtesy or a habit of a man who received visitors he expected to be cold. A writing desk stood by the window, its surface ordered in a way that suggested a systematic mind. He stood when she came in. She had prepared her sentences carefully, the way she prepared everything now, because care was the only resource she had in sufficient supply. She offered them in order, beginning with the acknowledgement, the explanation of the brooch's history, the opening of the false clasp. She placed the brooch on the corner of his desk and worked the hidden hinge with her thumbnail and unfolded the paper, and she watched him understand, as the paper came open, that he had bought something he had not known he was buying. He read it twice without speaking. She watched his face in the way she had learned to watch the faces of men with authority, for the small tells, the slight shifts, the recalculation of interest or annoyance that preceded any response that actually mattered. His face was still. She had been watching still faces for long enough to read the difference between a stillness that conceals indifference and a stillness that conceals something else entirely. He looked, for a moment, as though someone had handed him a fact he had been holding in the wrong shape for a long time. "Your grandmother was the 5th Viscount's legitimate eldest daughter," he said. She was, the eldest of 3 daughters. There were no sons from the first marriage. The 5th Viscount married again at 50, and his second wife had 2 sons, and the younger of those 2 sons was your grandfather. She kept her voice level. It is not a complicated chain. It simply was not recorded anywhere that survived the family's dispersal. "Except here," he said. "Except here." He looked at the paper again. Then he folded it back into its careful square, with a deliberateness she recognized as the same quality she had observed in him at the auction rooms. He did not handle things carelessly, and pressed it gently into the brooch's housing, and closed the false clasp. "Your cousin sold this without knowing what was inside it," he said. "He did not know. Or he did not care sufficiently to inquire." She paused. "I suspect the latter. Gerard is not a man who investigates things that might complicate his plans." "No," he said with a dryness she had not expected. "He is not." He set the brooch on the corner of the desk between them, facing her, as though he had made a decision about whose territory the object occupied. "You should have told me when I offered it to you at Stanton's." "I know," she said. "Why did you not?" She looked at the brooch for a moment, at the silver leaves and the pearl and the innocent face of an object that had kept its secret for 30 years. "Because I did not know yet whether you were the kind of man who would use what I told you to his own advantage," she said, "and now I do." He looked at her. "You could still," she said. "I am aware of that. If you wanted to establish a legal argument, any argument, about the original descent, about what was owed to that line of the family." "I have no such intention," he said. "No," she said. "I can see that you do not." She exhaled, quietly, the breath of a woman setting down a weight she has been carrying for 11 days. "I came to tell you what you bought. That is all. And to say that the document belongs in the hands of someone who understands what it is, and you are the only person alive, outside of myself, who has any legitimate reason to care." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the study window, a cart horse was moving slowly up the street, its breath visible in the cold morning air, its driver wrapped in a coat too thin for the temperature. Then he said, "What do you need?" It was not quite a question either. It was the kind of flat, precise thing a person says when they have made a determination and are asking for the parameters. She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "What do you need?" he said again. "Practically. You are in Frith Street lodgings on what I would estimate is a diminishing allowance, with no family who will take your situation seriously and a cousin who will continue to create difficulties as long as he believes I have no interest in the matter." He paused. "I have an interest in the matter. What do you need?" She looked at him for a long, careful moment. "I need no one to rescue me," she said. "I am managing." "You are managing very well," he said without irony. "I am asking what you need." She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about all practical things. "I need employment," she said, "that is suited to my education and will not cost me what remaining respectability I have. I speak French and read Italian, and my mother was educated beyond what the law of the time thought necessary for daughters. I have some facility with estate correspondence, if the work were clerical in nature." He considered this. "I have a housekeeper who manages the domestic accounts," he said, "and a steward who manages the estate. The correspondence to and from the solicitors in London has been handled by my secretary, who is leaving in January." He paused. "The work is not ornamental. It is detailed and requires precision." "I am precise," she said. She was employed at Ashfield House before the end of November, officially as a corresponding secretary engaged for the purpose of managing the estate's London correspondence during the period between secretaries. It was a reasonable arrangement. It was the kind of arrangement two sensible people make when they each have a legitimate need and the necessary means to address it. She told herself this clearly and often during the first 2 weeks when the arrangement had the clean lines of a practical transaction, and she sat at a table in the estate office and worked through the solicitor's letters and drafted replies in her careful hand and went home to Frith Street each evening. If you have found yourself thinking about someone whose attention you cannot quite name, you will understand what those evenings cost her. She worked. She was very good at working. She had the kind of mind that fastens onto a problem and does not release it until the problem is resolved, which was useful in matters of estate correspondence and considerably less useful in matters of the particular way a man's voice changes when he enters a room you are already in. She was aware of him in a way she had not been aware of anyone since before her father died, when she had still permitted herself the small luxury of awareness. It was inconvenient. She managed it. She had managed many things. The witnessing of her managing was not something she had anticipated. In the second week of her employment, on a Wednesday afternoon when the light had failed early and the estate office was lit only by candles and the fire, the housekeeper's youngest daughter had come in crying from the cold. A child of 7 or 8, red-nosed, distressed at some small injury she could not clearly articulate, a scraped palm from a fall in the stable yard. There was no one to receive her immediately. The housekeeper was occupied with the still room. The child stood in the doorway of the estate office and cried with the specific determination of a child who has decided that crying is the correct response and is prepared to commit to it. Cecily had set down her pen. She had drawn the child inside and found a clean cloth in the supply cabinet by the shelves and cleaned the small wound with a care she did not perform and did not explain, and held the hand still while she worked, and said in a low and practical voice that the worst of it was already over, and that a scrape in the stable yard was the kind of thing that left a small scar if one was lucky, and that small scars on the palms were a mark of a person who did things rather than simply watching others do them. The child had stopped crying by the end of this. She had looked at Cecily's hand, which had a faint scar along the base of one thumb from an incident with a cooking pot in the worst year of her father's illness, and pointed at it. "Did that hurt?" she said. "Very much at the time," Cecily said. "Rather less since." The child had considered this information with the gravity of someone filing it for future reference. Then she had gone back to the housekeeper, who had thanked Cecily at dinner with the kind of gratitude that a woman who manages a great household offers to someone who has quietly resolved a situation without being asked. He had been in the doorway for the last part of it. She had not known until she turned to find the handkerchief she had used still on the table, and looked up, and found him there with his coat on and his hat in his hand, as though he had come from outside and paused at the open door and stayed longer than his errand required. He had said nothing. He had looked at her for a moment. That patient, specific attention she was beginning to recognize, and then he had nodded once, which was not quite an acknowledgement of anything, and which she told herself, walking home that evening, meant nothing in particular. She had been telling herself many things lately, and believing fewer of them each day. The third week brought the first afternoon he found reason to sit at the desk near hers, rather than at the writing desk in the study. He had brought a set of tenant accounts, which was legitimate. He had brought them at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which was slightly less legitimate, since 3 o'clock was when the light came in the east windows at its best angle, and the estate office was warmer than the study, and she was there, and the accounts were here, and perhaps that was the entire explanation. He said almost nothing for an hour. She worked. He worked. The fire burned quietly. At some point she looked up to ask a question about a figure in the November accounts, and he was already looking at her, not with the evaluating attention of a man assessing a situation, but with the patient, specific attention of a man who has already assessed and arrived. She looked down at the accounts. "The figure in November," she said, "is £12 7 and the corresponding figure in the September ledger is £9 4. There is a discrepancy of £3. 3 shillings I cannot account for without more information." "There was a repair to the north fence," he said, in October. "The bill came in late. Then the October ledger should show the original expense, and November should show only the payment against a previously noted debt." "It should," he said. "It does not. My previous secretary was thorough in some respects and careless in others." A pause. "I will give you the original bill. You will see the discrepancy resolved." "Thank you," she said. He gave her the bill. Their hands did not touch. She noted this, and then noted that she had noted it, and returned to the accounts with more care than the accounts required. The following weeks accumulated quietly, in the way that important things accumulate when you are paying close attention to something else. There was the afternoon he walked her to the gate, when she left and stood there longer than the occasion required. There was the morning he mentioned, with no particular emphasis, that his grandmother had been fond of the morning room and had kept it in the way Cecily had found it, and that he had not changed it, because changing it had seemed like the wrong kind of alteration. There was the afternoon he asked her opinion on a question about the Langton estate tenants, a question that did not require her opinion, and which she recognized immediately as a question he had some other reason for asking. She answered all of it carefully and honestly, the way she answered everything, and went home each evening and sat by her small fire in Frith Street and held the brooch in her hand, and thought, "He does not owe you anything. He has already given you more than was required. You are the great-granddaughter of a viscount's eldest daughter, and you are sitting in lodgings on Frith Street counting the days until January, when the position will be filled by someone permanent, and your reason for being at Ashfield House will conclude. Think about what comes next. She was thinking about what came next when his letter arrived. It was not a long letter. He was not a man who wrote long letters, as she had read enough of his correspondence to know that his style was precise and unornamented, and said exactly what it needed to say without elaboration. This letter said, in 3 short paragraphs, that he had spoken to his solicitor about the document in the brooch, that the solicitor had confirmed it was a legitimate notarized record of legitimate descent, and that while the succession was not in question, he thought she should know that the record would be formally registered, at his direction, with the College of Arms, so that her ancestry was a matter of acknowledged record rather than a matter of private knowledge dependent on a single piece of paper that might be lost or disputed. The 4th paragraph was briefer than the others. It said simply that he hoped she would forgive him for taking this action without prior consultation. I was not certain you would permit it if I asked. I was more certain than I have been of many things this autumn that it was correct. She read the letter twice. She thought about the woman in violet silk at Stanton's, and about her cousin Gerard's voice when he said sorry for your trouble, and about the 1.5 years she had been managing alone, and about the 6th of March, 1792, and her grandmother's name in the solicitor's careful script. She wrote back the same afternoon. She had 4 drafts before she sent it. And what she finally sent said, among other things, that thank you was not sufficient. But it is what I have. And I find that I am glad you did not ask me first. Because you are right. That I would have refused. And I would have been wrong to do so. And I am not often wrong about practical things. Which perhaps tells you something. He came to the estate office the next morning at 9 o'clock, and did not pretend to have brought accounts. He stood just inside the doorway, which was a considerate thing to do, and he said that he would like to know if you intend to leave in January. I had planned to, she said. I would prefer you did not, he said. She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the estate office in the gray morning light, his hat in his hand, his face carrying the careful composure of a man who has made a decision that cannot be unmade, and is being precise about how he presents it. I am not asking for your pity, he said. I am asking for your company. Specifically and deliberately, for its own reasons, which include your intelligence and your honesty, and the fact that you told me the truth in this room on a Thursday morning in November when you had every practical reason not to. He paused. I have not made this request of anyone since my brother died. I am making it now because I think you know the difference between an arrangement and a choice. I do know the difference, she said. Then you know this is the second kind. She looked at the brooch, which she had begun wearing in the days since the letter, pinned to the plain collar of her dress, where her mother had worn it, the silver leaves, the single pearl, the document inside, folded small and kept. She looked at him. I need to think, she said. Yes, he said. Take the time you need. She took 2 weeks. She spent them with the careful attention she applied to problems that mattered, going over the ledger of what she knew about him, what she had observed, what she had inferred. He was precise and patient. He was honest in the specific way of people who have decided that honesty costs less in the long run than its alternative. He had held his house in suspension for 4 years, waiting for something she did not yet fully understand, and she had watched him begin, in small ways, to lift the suspension, and she thought she understood the cause without needing him to name it. She thought about her mother, who had folded a document into a silver brooch and worn it next to her heart for 30 years, against the day it would be needed, and had raised a daughter who understood what evidence was for and what it was not for, and how to tell the difference. She thought about the word he had used. choice. She wrote him a letter. She used 3 drafts and the good paper. What she finally sent was short, and said one thing that was as close to adequate as she could manage. She had been thinking for 2 weeks about what you said, and I find that the thinking has not produced any sufficient argument against it, which I believe you already knew. It would not. His reply arrived the same afternoon. It was brief, and it was in his hand, not his secretary's. He would be at the morning room at 10 o'clock tomorrow, if you are willing. 3 days before that letter arrived, Cousin Gerard had paid a call. She had been told of it by the housekeeper, who conveyed the message with the careful neutrality of a woman who knew more than she was paid to say. A Mr. Vane had called at the estate office, had been informed that Miss Vane was not present, and had left a note. The note was brief. Gerard's notes were always brief when he wished to wound without the inconvenience of detail. It said only that he had heard she had found a situation at Ashfield House. I hope you understand that a woman in your position, poor thing as I know you must be, alone and with so little, can ill afford to mistake a gentleman's charity for anything warmer. The Earl's steward has confirmed to me that the position ends in January. I wish you the same luck in your next endeavor that you have required in all the others. The 3rd time he called her poor thing, he did not even bother to put it in a voice. He had written it down and handed it to a housekeeper and walked away, which was so precisely like him that she had almost smiled. She had folded the note and set it in the fire, which was the correct place for it. She had then sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and thought, very carefully, about what was true. What was true was that Gerard had been wrong about the nature of the Earl's attention from the beginning, and wrong about the nature of her own situation, and wrong about her prospects, and that his wrongness was not malicious so much as it was the specific wrongness of a man who had never learned to look at a woman like Cecily and see anything worth looking at. What was also true was that Lord Ashfield had been looking. She had known it for weeks. She had known it and had not permitted herself to act on the knowledge, because the distance between a gentleman looking and a gentleman choosing was the entire question. And she was a woman who required evidence. She had the letter now. She had 2 weeks to think. His reply arrived the same afternoon. It was brief, and it was in his hand, not his secretary's. He would be at the morning room at 10 o'clock tomorrow, if you are willing. She was willing. The engagement was announced in December, a small notice in the Gazette, the kind that records practical things without sentiment. Cecily was sitting in the morning room when the copy arrived, and she read her own name in it, and thought about her mother reading such a notice, and about her grandmother, who had never had such a notice because her line had stopped at the border of what titles could recognize, and who had left what she could carry in a silver brooch and trusted it to a daughter, and then to a granddaughter, and then, at last, to the right room. The notice produced a second round of opinion through the season's remaining drawing rooms. A woman in violet silk said, "Poor thing," not bothering to lower her voice, to a companion who happened to know better, and said nothing. Some truths did not require performance. They only required to be real. The dark hangings came down from the upper galleries at Ashfield House in January, and the windows let in the full pale light of a cold English morning, and the house looked like itself. On the mantelpiece in the morning room, on a small stand of velvet-covered wire, Cecily set the brooch. It sat in the morning room light, and every person who came into the room paused at it. The old-fashioned workmanship, the silver leaves, the quality of attention the object seemed to require, as though it had been waiting a long time to be properly seen. She sat by the fire one evening in late January and watched the brooch in the candlelight, and the house was quiet around her, and he was across the room at the writing desk. And she thought about her grandmother, and about the word noble, and about how it could mean a title conferred by law, and also a quality carried in the body, and how the first kind could be sold at auction for £11, and the second kind could not be sold at any price. She had been told, in various ways and by various people, for the better part of 2 years now, that she had no proof of anything. She had been told she was a poor relation, a nowhere woman, a thing without provenance. She knew what she was. The fire settled. He looked up from the writing desk and across the room at her, and she held his gaze without any particular effort, the way a person holds the gaze of someone for whom composure is no longer required. And after a moment he returned to his letter. She reached for the brooch on its stand and turned it once in her fingers, and the silver leaves caught the firelight, and the pearl was warm against her palm. She had carried this a long time. She set it back. The proof was not only in the paper anymore. The paper was still there, folded behind the false clasp, intact. The proof was also in the room, in the open galleries and the morning light, and the fact of the house no longer held in suspension, and in the particular quality of the quiet between two people who have stopped pretending the quiet is accidental. She was the granddaughter of an Ashfield daughter. She was home. Thank you for staying with Cecily until the end. If her story moved you, leave a word below.